Hello and welcome to week 12 of plant biology. This week we're talking about true plant systematics, so understanding how the true plants evolved and what that sort of natural history of those plants evolutionary track is. And the reading is going to be in the Biology 2E textbook, and it's going to be chapter 25. So True Plant Systematics, chapter 25 in the Biology 2E textbook. So this chapter is going to be talking about the early evolutionary history of photosynthetic organisms. It's important to understand the evolutionary pathway that the sort of modern plants that we have today takes from single-celled photosynthetic organisms, because that natural history relates to what we see today. It starts out talking about some of the adaptations of life on land. So life for photosynthetic algae is significantly different than life for an oak tree outside the building here. So some of those adaptations that we have are alternation of generations. So we have this ability for organisms to separate out different life stages in their reproductive structures. Development of protective structures for developing embryos. So seeds, for example, are a protective structure on developing embryos. Those are important adaptations to land. Land is a difficult environment for organisms, especially considering they've only evolutionary recently moved out of aquatic organisms. So they're evolving ways to meet these new needs that their new environments are presenting to them. Other structures such as an apical meristem on root tissue, again, helps protect delicate growth structures. We also see the development of vascular tissue. If you live in an entirely aquatic environment, you don't really need vascular tissue. You simply diffuse in and out of your environment, and you don't have to move water from one part of your plant's body to another. If you were in an aquatic environment, you simply diffuse throughout your entirety. If you live on land, you need to be able to move water up from your roots and move material back down to your from the shoots. So, excuse me. So this ability to move water in a non-aquatic environment is remedied by the evolution of vascular tissue. We also see the evolution of structural molecules like lignins, photoprotective pigments to prevent additional damage from ultraviolet radiation, and we also eventually see anti-predation strategies. Animal evolution on land didn't occur until after plants had taken over, but we still see eventually the development of these anti-predation strategies in plants. All of these different sorts of strategies really start to just build the overall story of the development of land plants from their aquatic ancestors, and that's really what this beginning part of this chapter is talking about. The chapter then goes on to sort of talk about the major divisions of these early land plants, and again they start out at the beginning with green algae, which are decidedly not land plants. They are definitely aquatic, but in order to tell this story effectively, they start at the beginning. So we look at green algae and the various forms that there are. Green algae reproduce sexually and asexually, so there's lots of different sort of lifestyle strategies that the green algae have, but they all have photosynthesis in common, and moving those photosynthetic sort of plant organisms to the land is really what this chapter is talking about. After we get this sort of movement of green algae onto land, now we're starting to talk about very, very primitive plants that we call bryophytes. You guys are definitely familiar with bryophytes. Mosses are bryophytes. They are simply the modern ancestors of these early inhabitants of this brand new terrestrial environment that before then plants had never been able to occupy. So the mosses, there's a couple other groups, so liverworts and hornworts, which you're probably less familiar with, at least in name. But one thing that all of these bryophytes have in common is that they do not have vascular tissue. So they do not have xylem, they do not have phloem, and they rely on diffusion to move water in and out of their plants, plant structures, as well as to remove waste. So mosses are usually reserved for damp environments, and that's usually where you see them. After the bryophytes invade land, then we get the evolution of this next group, which are called the seedless vascular plants. So what we have is this development from these avascular plants with the bryophytes, and we are starting to see the evolution of this vascular tissue. So the xylem and the phloem, we talked about those vascular tissues before. This is where we're seeing these evolutionary steps taking place about 430 million years ago. So with the introduction of this vascular tissue, now we can start developing a bigger, more robust structure on land. We also see leaf and root development. Those are all important characteristics of plants that we see in the world today. These early seedless vascular plants, the ancestors of these plants still definitely exist on Earth today, and those generally we call the ferns and their allies. Ferns are usually sort of the most commonly associated seedless vascular plants that most people are sort of aware of, but there are a number of other ones. There's a group called the club mosses, and they're, usually they're about yay tall, and they look like little bitty pine trees. Often you'll see them growing in forest floors. You can see horsetails. Horsetails are commonly encountered in ditches, and I know in some agricultural settings, at least in Iowa, horsetails have become resistant to herbicide, and in some places are becoming a nuisance species in agricultural fields. We also have whisk ferns, and of course the true ferns. So we really are starting to see the development from these single-celled aquatic organisms to these multicellular land organisms that don't have vascular tissue, and then we start to see the development of these multicellular land organisms that do have vascular tissue. So in this evolutionary pathway, this is what we're looking at in this chapter. So this is just the very beginning of this evolutionary story of true plant systematics, but we have to start somewhere, and this is the beginning of that story. This chapter wraps up talking a little bit about the sort of ecological and social impacts that these organisms have in our world today, and these groups of plants are still alive today. We still have photosynthetic algae, we still have mosses and liverworts and hornworts, and we still have ferns and club mosses and equisetum and things like that. So they are still existing in the world today, but a major contributor that this class of organisms has in sort of a societal sense is that many of these organisms are contributing to the development of fossil fuel resources that humans are utilizing today. So the utilization of coal, for example, is fossilized plant material from these ferns and fern allies, these massive swamps that existed in the time of the dinosaurs, and humans are simply digging up this carbon and utilizing it as a fossil fuel energy source. So although these plants tend not to be dominant species in habitats, they do play a significant role even today, albeit primarily in the fossil form. All right, I hope you enjoy your reading. Again, this week's reading is from the Biology 2E textbook, and it's chapter 25, and we're talking about true plant systematics. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.